perfect transition from the last conversation to this one, in which you will see the title is The California Experiment in Criminal Justice. These three women are actually great voices on this particular issue. The California Experiment, I just need to begin there for people who do not know about it. The California Experiment has to do with how we should handle incarceration and how to handle the future of it as well. And so, Marisa, if I can just start with you, just kind of lay out what the intention, and then we'll talk about how it's been carried out, but what the intention of this proposition was.
So Prop 47 is doing what voters intended it to do. It's reducing state prison and county jail population, and it's taking those savings and will reallocate it beginning next year into crime prevention programs, mental health and substance abuse treatment programs, programs for at-risk youth, K through 12, and trauma recovery services. And importantly, this third element I always like to talk about, the law is retroactive. So no matter how old a felony might be on your record, Prop 47 gives you the opportunity to reduce that to a misdemeanor if it's one of the eligible 6 offenses. And really changing your record is really about changing your life. And we've heard through all of the panels this morning about the collateral consequences, not just of a criminal record, but in particular about a felony on your record. Anyone with a felony in California has 4,800 restrictions placed on them.
So you get down to the nitty-gritty on that. So you're saying 4,000. So if there's a felony in my record and it is not clear, what kinds of restrictions are we talking about?
There are a lot of occupational restrictions. The biggest one that we talk about is you can't get a barber's license. You can't get a cosmetology license. You can't be a barber. You can't be a professional dog walker. If you have a felony on your record, you cannot be a professional dog walker. A lot of occupational licenses, the granting of which are discretionary. You can't work in a hospital, in a school, in law enforcement, and so on. You also can't receive a Pell Grant for education. You might be prohibited from Section 8 housing. So there are all of these collateral consequences that make it that much more difficult for you not just to re-enter your community, but really increases your recidivism chances. Now, I want to just take one tiny step back, 3 points. What got us to Prop 47? Between 1981 and 2011, spending in California on our prisons increased by 1,500%. We were pouring California taxpayer dollars, and we built 22 prisons, 1 UC university, and our recidivism rate was still about 60, 65, 70%. People were still cycling in and out of prison. We're just pouring money into a failed system. So Prop 47 really was a response to that and the Supreme Court mandate to reduce the overpopulation in prisons.
Okay, I just need to clarify something because we want to be fully disclosed here, the involvement of other organizations in this. Prop 47, as you say, was a very big campaign in 2014, and among the organizations that supported it were 2 organizations that are underwriting this event. That would be the California Wellness Foundation and Open Society Foundation, so we do want to be transparent about that. And also California Society for Safety and Justice, which is where Marisa works, is also supported by both of those organizations.
Yes.
So just for full transparency and disclosure on that. Okay, you are clear that it has been effective, but that is not everyone's view. And Heather, I think you could speak to that. Your view about where 47 has not lived up to expectations.
Well, I think Marisa gave a good description of the aims of Prop 47, but she said it's working as voters intended it to. I'm not sure whether voters intended to bring in a crime increase, but according to the state attorney general, last year in California, there was a 10% increase in violent crime, a 10% increase in homicide. This year in Los Angeles City, we've got a 13% increase in violent crime. Arrests are down 5%. The Bureau of Justice Assistance, a federal research agency, was asked to study the effects of Prop 47 in Los Angeles by City Attorney Mike Foyer and found that it produced a 23% increase in robberies. I agree with the motivation of Prop 47 and with the expressions on the previous panel that prison is often a squalid, soul-crushing, spirit-crushing experience But where I disagree is that this country is lightly throwing people in prison for minimal crimes. I think the data shows, according to the JFA Institute, which is an anti-incarceration group, they estimate that only 3% of all people who've committed violent or property crimes actually end up in prison. The system tries to divert as many offenders as possible out of prisons, whether it's into jails for short-term stays or community supervision. And while the stories of people who have been put into prison can be heartbreaking, and one feels, hearing that side of the story, a sense of injustice, I think we also need to hear the voices of people in the community who, in my experience, attending police community meetings in high crime areas, want more policing and more incarceration. I've rarely been in a community police meeting where I haven't heard some variant of the following questions. You arrest the dealers and they're back on the corner the next day. Why can't you keep them off the street? There's kids on my stoop hanging out and fighting and smoking weed. Why can't you arrest them for loitering? That is what the police are hearing from people in these communities, and why they engage in sort of low-level public order enforcement. It's in response to community demands, not out of some kind of vendetta against the community.
I want to give, and I know there are emotions out there, and I want people to be able to raise their questions, but I also want to be fair here. And hear what everyone has to say. Charis, you also look at numbers. You look at these questions too. Can you respond to?
Sure. Well, I have a couple things to respond to. First, so I'm a criminologist. I study crime and crime trends, and I just want to say one thing about these crime increases, which are real, 13%, these are real numbers. There has not been one proper evaluation that has linked those crime trends back to Prop 47. So,
Okay, but
so my point about that is that we need to do a proper evaluation, just like we've needed to do a proper evaluation of other criminal justice reform in California, like realignment, which is what myself and colleagues have done. So it's about really what the numbers say in terms of criminal justice reform. The other thing I just want to respond to is that this is a historic moment in this country. We are at a crisis with mass incarceration. I disagree that it isn't at crisis. We have 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's incarcerated population. And unfortunately, California has been a leader in that problem. California incarcerates, other than Texas, more folks than any other state. What we had been doing for the longest time, 30 years, incarcerating people, building prisons, did not work, as evidenced by a recidivism rate around 65 to 70%.
and the courts found that California.
Not only that, exactly. The courts came in, the Supreme Court came in and said the conditions in these prisons are deplorable. Not only do we have overcrowding, but we have a number
and Heather's
of health
acknowledging that.
and mental health. Right. So then the question becomes, well, what's the solution? Do we double down and continue to incarcerate, or do we look for alternative, different ways to deal with what's happening in the state? And I think realignment and Prop 47 are very innovative ways, and at least what we know about realignment's impact, no impact on violent crime, and a very, very modest impact on property crime, as my colleague Carol Saron and I at UC Irvine just published in the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science.
I would love there to be evidence-based practices for alternatives for prison. Prison is a last-ditch response to the plague of crime that many communities experience. And if there were alternatives that were proven to be as effective in reducing criminal activity, by all means implement them. But the Justice Department has a website that evaluates programs, reentry programs, alternatives to prison. And despite the ubiquity of the phrase now evidence-based practices, there are very few. It looked at 6 reentry programs and was able to judge none of them as effective. Joan Peter Cilia of Stanford, who is a big advocate for trying to figure out ways to de-incarcerate, has herself acknowledged that we do not yet have alternatives that have been shown to work. And in fact, we're repeating some of the same programs that have been shown not to work, like intensive supervised probation.
But so 47 was directed at a couple of things specifically. It wasn't specifically at overcrowding.
Prop 47 specifically reclassified 6 low-level nonviolent offenses, simple drug possession, and 5 petty theft offenses. So it does not address violent crime, and it focused on low-level nonviolent offenses so that resources can be focused on violent crime. Community safety is the #1 issue that needs to be addressed by government and by law enforcement. Community safety is critical, right? We don't have an unending pot of money. We can't lock everyone away. We need alternatives. We don't just need alternatives to incarceration. We need focused deterrence programs. We need to target resources to violent crime. Prop 47 allows low-level nonviolent offenders to get treatment where needed, so we can focus resources on chronic offenders, so we can provide those expensive prison beds for violent offenders. And importantly, no other state has done this. It takes that savings and it reallocates it to crime prevention programs.
Has that money reached the communities
No,
yet?
it's early next spring, and it's not supposed to. So Prop 47 passed in November of 2014. They needed the first fiscal year to calculate the savings. It's in the budget, in the governor's budget for next year, $68 million to be reallocated. Early next year, there's the executive steering committee made up of community members and reentry folks who are working on the criteria for that competitive grant process. So it's not going to be allocated proportionally among the counties. Counties have to really partner between county agencies and community-based organizations to show that they have programs that work on alternatives to incarceration to apply for that money.
Heather's new book is The War on Cops, which really, I think, kind of goes to part of this question. That is this, in your view, in a sense, this kind of experiment creating a problem for officers, a problem for street-level police?
Well, officers, in their experiences that I've talked to, and prosecutors as well, with regards to Prop 47 specifically, are finding that people are turning treatment down because the jail time that they'd be facing if they're even arrested, because a lot of cops are saying it's not even worth it. So a lot of shoplifting arrests, shopkeepers are not even calling them in because they face so little time now with the downgrading of what's a larceny for felony purposes. But people are not taking treatment up. They'd rather just do a very quick weekend or a couple weekends in jail than go into a treatment program. This was the experience California had with Prop 36, which was made a similar promise. People will get treatment instead of jail, and nobody showed up. The recidivism was enormous.
This is an important, thank you. This is a really important point that Heather raises, right? So one of the things that Prop 47 did is really pull back the curtain on decades of outdated practices, jail management practices, law enforcement practices, sentencing practices, and prosecution practices. A long time ago, someone somewhere decided misdemeanors are not that serious. So, and they take a lot of trouble booking. Takes an officer off the street. It takes a long time to book someone for a misdemeanor. So we're going to cite and release for misdemeanors. Well, when other offenses get deemed a misdemeanor, there's no adjustment to that local practice. We can't just continue the same old practices when there are changes to state law. The resistance to the reform is the issue here, not the reform itself. We need law enforcement, judges, prosecutors to treat misdemeanors importantly, to adjust the criteria for drug courts
to
and
respond to the thing that Heather was actually talking about.
Well, and so what happens is, you're right, they do get out rather quickly because jail management practices allow for early releases. Now, I will say that after Prop 47, the reduction in county jail beds has allowed local jails to focus beds on more violent offenses, and people are serving a larger percentage of their sentence for more violent offenses. So that was helpful. But to your point, that's caused by jail management and law enforcement practices. We work with law enforcement very closely, and they'll say, well, Prop 47 doesn't allow us to arrest for a Prop 47 offense, but that isn't true. Prop 47 didn't touch the penal code that gives an officer arresting authority for a misdemeanor, and you can still go to jail for up to a year for a misdemeanor if you're prosecuted as such, and if the judge gives you a year, and if the jail holds you a year. Prosecutors can bundle and aggregate misdemeanors and threaten you with the felony, but to do that, they have to hold the file open, and that's hard to do. So there are ways to respond to that.
Well, I just wanted to add, I want to sort of step us back for the bigger picture, because I think we get lost in the weeds a lot of the time. What Prop 47, what realignment allows us to do is to bring back sort of into play a focus on prevention. For so long, our system has focused on what we do after an offender commits a crime. And that has been really a law enforcement sort of response. Thank you. And really what we need to think about is that it takes both preventative efforts to deal with the crime problem as well as police and law enforcement efforts. And for the longest time, we were really focused on law enforcement and police, who have received lots and lots of funding, and we've sort of neglected the preventative side. And until we truly begin to address the root causes of what get people into prison in the first place, all of this is not going to fix it.
Heather, is the problem? Is that the problem?
Clearly, the problem is crime. The problem is crime, not incarceration. We have a crime problem, not an incarceration problem. And the problem is what's causing crime.
Hang on, guys.
I would disagree that we haven't been spending money on what is conventionally understood as the causes of crime. I think there's a lot of social welfare spending in Los Angeles and across the country. There are a lot of programs. I would say, if you ask me what are the causes of crime, if I could wave my wand, I would give every child a mother and a father. I think with children being raised without their fathers, you've got a lot of involvement in gangs.
Guys, let her talk.
That, I think, is the most important advantage that people in stable upper-class communities have, is they have the resources of both parents.
Okay.
Can I say one thing about crime?
Okay, hang on, guys.
So, I mean, it's actually not the case that crime trends and incarceration rates flow perfectly. If you look historically, you will see times where crime rates maybe stay flat or go down and our incarceration rates go up. And it depends on how we respond to the behavior and what we classify as crime and how long people go to prison and what range of offenses we incarcerate for. What we have done is incarcerate too many people for too long. And what that does is send them back in. And in California, until prior to realignment, folks that violated probation or parole for whatever reason were often sent right back up to state prison. And so that bulk of the recidivists were people who could have been dealt with more locally at a much easier level. And realignment has addressed that to some degree. And the reality is that recidivism rates have not gone up since we implemented realignment. And the one finding that speaks to what you were suggesting about reentry is that we found in our analysis that those counties that chose to spend their realignment dollars on reentry and rehabilitation fared slightly better than those counties that were more law enforcement focused. In other words, those counties that put the money towards programming did much better than those counties that simply said, we're going to take that money and build more jail beds. So this should incentivize counties throughout the state to be creative in how they locally deal with their offender population.
When the money comes.
Well, with realignment it came, $1 billion a year given to the counties to do what they saw fit with their realignment dollars. And some counties said, I'm going to take that money and I'm just going to put offenders locally in jail, the ones that were in the state, and others said, I'm going to think outside the box and try and figure out how we can use community supervision, drug and rehabilitation programs.
So was there, as people came out of the prison system and back to the county jails, did that just rob Peter to pay Paul, or I don't...
So there was some time that it took to adjust. Every single county had to come up with a plan. How was it going to spend its realignment dollars? It wasn't just like one day the state prisons opened up and everyone came home and let's hope it all works out. This was lots of planning. Stakeholders, including law enforcement officials, were involved at the table designing implementation plans for every single county. You could go online and read every single county's implementation plan. They're very detailed. A lot of my students are analyzing them and doing research on them.
But there are, as Heather points out, law enforcement, the LA County Sheriff, there are people who have said, it's actually been hard on us. We have seen an increase in crime.
Of course, with you have a change, there's always going to be adjustment in time, and not everybody is a huge fan of realignment, and people have lots of stories that they tell about it. My point is, let's move beyond the stories. What do the data show? And do the data show, does it work, does it not work? And what we found in the data, and I'm happy to appoint anybody to these studies, is that realignment, and we don't know yet for Prop 47, so that's a big question mark, but what we know for realignment is it had no impact on violent crime and a very, very modest impact on property crime, in particular auto theft.
I would just again invoke the Bureau of Justice Assistance study. This is a federal study. This is about the gold standard, that we're looking at trends pre-109, between 109 and 47 and post-47. And they estimated what the trend lines were before these initiatives and after, and they have concluded that 47 resulted in a 23% increase in robbery. That is a massive change.
But the thing with the studies is you really need 3 years of data before a reform and 3 years after to really look at what's happening, right? So you need sufficient data. We're in year 2. The money hasn't come down, so we don't even know what the landscape's going to look like. Also, I might add, law enforcement needs to adjust practices before the money even comes down. We can make adjustments to our prosecution. But I'll say there was a Pew study that did a study on 23 states that have done something similar to Prop 47. They raised the threshold on what constitutes a felony, but they didn't do the reallocation piece. So they sort of reclassified some felonies to misdemeanors. In that study, there was no impact on crime in any of those 23 states, and they studied data 3 years before and 3 after, and it's on the Pew website. We've got to wait for the data to come in and the reallocation to come down to do a complete evaluation.
And it's clear that there are other agencies around
there's
the
a
country
huge
that are looking
increase.
at
There's
California.
homelessness, poverty, addiction. There are so many factors.
And I know that there are people who want to talk, and at the risk of keeping us here for hours, I'm going to let you talk in a minute, but I do need to issue a small correction, which is that California Wellness did not actually support Proposition 47 itself. They don't take a position, they're a private foundation, they don't take a position on the ballot measures or pending legislation. Appreciate that correction. Okay. Reasonable questions, all right? No grandstanding here, all right? Lady in the front. Yeah, it's okay. Right here.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, thanks. Kristen Glover. I'm wondering a couple of things briefly. If when someone comes out of prison, if we continue to punish them by not even allowing them, for instance, to get a job as a dog walker, why are we wondering about recidivism? But, and that has to be changed. But I feel that the focus of the panel is so narrow at the thinking that if we take a few steps back, we have to look at the trade agreements that have created joblessness and poverty in this country and hopelessness, and where are we as a nation choosing to spend our assets, throwing money away when we could be spending it at home.
So that's a really critical point. It's similar to, it's the equivalent of us waiting for crime to happen and then respond to it, instead of really focusing resources on helping individuals address the root causes of low-level offenses. And really, I would say mass incarceration is the thing that's the biggest breakup of the family unit, right? Separating families because of mass incarceration. And then having people come back out with no access to services or jobs. But that is the same, where should our resources go?
Okay, voice in the back.
Yes, my name is Professor Michelle Goodwin. I think it's really important that we pay attention to the fact that crime is far more ubiquitous than what's described here. On every college campus across the country, you have enormous crime happening every weekend. Underage drinking, drug use, rapes. That's crime. It's not accounted for if you go to Stanford on the weekend, Berkeley on the weekend, you go across the country, that is crime. And until you begin to include that in crime, I also want to make a reference point to the heterosexual family as doing some powerful work. Let's be clear, there's been a history of misogyny, incest, domestic violence and so much more. Every country club across this country harbors individuals who've committed enormous crimes within their families and within our society. So let's be clear about what we mean by crime. It's not simply that the police knock on doors and drag people out with. It's a lot that simply gets overlooked in discourse.
Well, and as a criminal, yeah.
Heather, I think you should be able to respond to that. You want to say something? Hang on.
I would recommend on some grounds Alice Goffman's Running with the Predators, a story of sort of analysis of crack dealers in Philadelphia, and the boys themselves said they needed their fathers. So there are obviously alternative situations of families, and they can be extraordinarily successful. And of course, there are millions of heroic single mothers out there who are working their hearts out to raise successful law-abiding boys and succeeding magnificently. But social science is pretty much univocal on this, that children raised with only one parent have much higher rates of involvement in criminal justice matters, teen pregnancy themselves. As far as crimes on campuses, the police are responding to 911 calls. They're responding to victims. The people partying on Stanford are by and large not calling the police. What we're talking about here are the type of drive-by shootings that are taking thousands of black lives.
I think her point.
Say one thing.
I think her point. I think her point was maybe we need to look at what we call crime in a different way.
Okay.
And,
well,
and what we,
I
what
think
crime
what
we
numbers.
what
yeah.
crime,
what the
I
numbers
think the
mean.
bottom
I
line
think
is
the loss of children's lives in drive-by shootings is probably our most serious
I mean, one of
crime
the things
problem
you learn as
today.
a criminologist right off the bat is that there's a very big discrepancy between what arrests are, who's arrested, and what is self-reported crime.
Right.
That there's a very large gap. So not every crime gets arrested, and so the question is,
Yeah, I
is
think
that
that was-
socially patterned? And it absolutely is. And it's patterned by race, it's patterned by by class, and a number of other factors.
In my understanding, arrests match completely the National Crime Victimization Survey. As victims
No.
report their assailants, it matches the
They
arrests.
they
It
do
does.
not match
It does.
perfectly.
Okay, guys. Okay, we're
Absolutely.
running out.
Robert
We're actually
Sampson.
over time, but can I get another question? Can we get another question? All right. Right up front.
Hello, my name is Eric Gordon. We've heard some welcome controversy actually today. I thank you for getting some debate going.
That's good.
I think the parameters are limited, though, even in this debate, because the most that we're hearing is comparisons between California and other states that have instituted some reform. But I'm sure probably 3/4 of the people in this room have seen Michael Moore's movie, Where to Invade Next. And we see from that, and also from the statistics that we just heard, about 5% of the population in the of the world's population and 25% of the world's incarcerated people, that other countries, mostly Northern and Western Europe, do a whole lot better with crime and incarceration. They certainly have crime, but they deal with it in so much more humane way. Why can't we, let down our arrogance for a little bit and start looking at what are the answers and conclusions and solutions that other countries have come up with, and start applying some best practices that we can get from them?
Oh,
Can I just
absolutely.
And
respond?
finally-
I would say that those international comparisons leave out crime rates. Our homicide rate in the United States is 7 times higher than that of the Western industrial countries plus Japan. Our gun homicide rate, which I would think people in this room would be concerned about, is about 22 times higher than those Western countries. And if you look at youth gun homicide, it's about 40 times higher. So the comparisons are simply not apt. Our prison population is over 50% due to violent crime, about 20% due
what I
to
think
That is not,
property
that is
crime.
not,
So
I have to say so. What we have done if you look at the trebling of our prison population over time, it's not because the number of violent crimes have increased, it's because we had a war on drugs and we incarcerated it is so true. Most of what we have incarcerated for are not violent offenses. Those have not risen dramatically in the way that you've said, and it certainly hasn't risen dramatically enough to account for the ballooning of our criminal justice system. Where we are different is we are an outlier in the United States because we incarcerate. We choose to respond that way. We have doubled down and we have missed the mark. We have overdone it. And now we are scrambling. And by the way, at this time, you know, in this era of political bipartisanship, this is the one area that you see both conservatives and progressives agreeing on. We have to figure out how to solve this problem. California, I think, is leading the way, and I hate to focus only on California here, but we are being watched very carefully by other states who are also considering prison downsizing and ways to do that without harming public safety. And I think we're at a really historic moment here, and hopefully other states will pick up some of the successes that California has had.
And Joie, if I could add, if you go to the Alliance for Safety and Justice website, there's a national report, that's our sister organization, that was just published of crime survivors. And crime survivors, by a margin of 2 to 1, prefer treatment, prevention, rehabilitation, restorative justice over this punitive system of punishing people for crimes. Many people who go to prison are crime survivors themselves. You can't read a file of someone who has committed some offense, someone who's self-medicating, who isn't in pain, who needs services. So the crime survivors, by a margin of 2 to 1, want treatment, prevention, services, and programming over punishment.
if I can just say, there was never a period in the prison buildup that was not overwhelmingly driven by violent crime. And since the 2000s, the increase in prisons has been exclusively for longer sentences for violent crime.
You need to read the
Read John
criminological
Pfaff.
research. on
I
prison
have.
buildup.
Read John
Clearly,
Pfaff.
this is a subject that people want to discuss further, but unfortunately, we are way past our time. I appreciate all of you, really all of you, for speaking out on the subject, and all of you guys, too. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisa.
Thank you,
Good
Heather.
debate.